Welcome to the place where we learn about improv, 'cause public speaking can take you so far. Improv speaking, say yes and flex your creative thinking. Improv speaking, say yes and flex your creative thinking.
Welcome, everyone, to the Improvly Speaking podcast. Thanks for joining another episode. Happy to have you on. Happy to have you here. And I have to say, you have joined a really special episode. We have a special, fun guest who is going to teach us all about adult learning today. And if you're like, what's adult learning? That's a good question. She's going to tell us all about it today, too. And I'm excited for that. If you're joining for the first time, let me give you a little rundown of what this podcast is about. On this podcast, I like to talk to experienced improvisers and public speakers. I like to talk to people who have taken improv classes to level up their career and professional skills. And I like to talk to people who use improvisation in their daily lives, but may not consider it to be improvisation. They might call it something else. They might not think about it. So our guest today is an experienced speaker. And I think improv fits in with what she talks about, even though she might not think of it as improv. So we're really hitting two sets of the guest goals here, which I'm really excited for. So let's jump in. Let's get to it. Let me tell you all about our special guest today. Our special guest today is Dr. Carrie Graham. Dr. Graham is based in Charlotte, North Carolina, and she is an adult learning expert and instructional design strategist. She earned her PhD in learning, leadership, and educational policy with a research focus on adult learning at the University of Connecticut, or UConn. She is the owner of Carrie O Learning and Solutions, and she helps businesses improve learning outcomes by strategically integrating adult learning best practices. She is also an adult learning adjunct professor for the Adult Education Graduate Program at North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University. She is a published author, researcher, and conference presenter with 25 plus years experience. I don't know where those 25 years come from, because that's amazing. 25 plus years experience in learning, instructional design, and leadership development across multiple industries. Please welcome the super inquisitive, informative, and insightful Dr. Carrie Graham.
Oh my goodness, Dana. Thank you for having me. Quite the introduction. That is who I am. I'd like to think, though, that I'm more. And the improv piece, I'm excited to explore with you when we get to that. But thank you so much for having me. I'm honored. I am truly honored to be in conversation with you and to share some insight with your audience.
Yes, Carrie, thanks again for coming on. And for our listeners, Carrie and I met at a Risk Takers accountability group online, and we've stayed in touch. I think that group was around like 2020, 2021. So it's been a little bit. We haven't met in a while with that group, but we've since stayed in touch. And I feel like we've been cheering each other on in our respective businesses for a while now. And I'm just so glad to have you on. I'm so glad to record one of our conversations, because we've talked about these things, but we never hit record. So why not just hit the record button?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And there's, I think one of the reasons why I love to talk to you, Dana, is because I never know where the conversation is going to go. And if I'm understanding improv correctly, that's consistent with improv. And so I'm delighted to have this conversation with you.
I love that. I'm just laughing like I'm wild card. Like you never know what you're gonna get. Wild card. But that's fun. That makes life interesting, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, and Carrie, I'm curious if you remember, just throwing it back to the risk takers accountability group. Do you remember what the quote unquote risk you were taking at that point was?
Yeah, I would say that it was around my business, and it was not playing small and
Oh,
trying to
nice.
identify what that means for me, and how best to step into it. And so, a lot has happened in the 2 years since we, or so that we met. Um, but I will say that it was it was great to have time and space, um, and accountability partners to explore my needs at that time. And so it was delightful. And for your audience members who have not um, been accountable with at least one other person around risk taking, I really encourage people to do it because it really is an empowering activity.
Yeah, what I loved about that group is just what we considered risks too, because there are some daredevils out there who are like jumping off cliffs and
Yeah.
climbing mountains and stuff. But our form of risks were more like getting out in front of people, not
Yeah.
playing quote unquote small, playing
Yeah.
big in terms of our
Mhm.
business. I think someone was trying to do a course at that time and it
Yeah.
was really hard. Someone else
Yeah.
was nervous about going live on Facebook and
Mhm.
Instagram. Like,
Mhm.
it's funny and interesting what we consider quote unquote risks. And then you
Mhm.
do them for a while and you're like, okay, that's not so bad, but you just have to do them. Like, you got to really just do it and take that risk for them to not feel like a risk after a while.
Absolutely. And I would add that that's part of life, and we truly grow the most when we stretch ourselves, no matter how uncomfortable it may be, or even how unclear things are. It really is an opportunity to grow, and we learn best through mistakes. We definitely learn through mistakes. And so take the risk, whatever it may be, whether it's asking someone for a sale, whether it's signing up for an improv class, which I haven't done yet, but I'm going to this year.
It's on your
Um,
list.
it
It's on
is
your
on my
list.
list. It's on my list. Just whatever the risk is, having, I don't know, things in your personal life, whatever you identify as the risk, please know that Dana and I have been there, and it's worth doing. Whatever it is truly worth doing. And it's often not as painful as we think it is.
Yeah, exactly. Man, you said that so beautifully. I'm really starting off this episode on an inspirational note. I love it.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that kind of segues and leads into adult learning a bit and just, how adults learn. And to tell you the truth, I didn't really know much about quote unquote adult learning until I started talking with you. And I think we all have heard that there are auditory learners and visual learners, tactile learners, but I know there's way more to it, just that for adult learning. So, Carrie, this is probably the simplest but most expansive question for you to answer and for us to start with. But can you tell our listeners what is adult learning?
Absolutely. So the definition is really understanding how adults learn, basically. And it's looking at the things that support their learning and the potential barriers to their learning. And that's where it goes off into different capacities. And so one of the areas that I focus on, or two areas that I focus on in my business, is workplace learning, as well as understanding who the individual is as a learner, so that we can either identify the barriers or create sources of support in their learning experience. And typically that's at work. So um, it is, people often, and I will just say this, I didn't know what adult learning was until I got my PhD. And the
Oh, wow.
reason,
Okay.
yeah, the reason I share that is because I was doing adult learning, right? I am an adult learner and I was facilitating it, but I didn't know the theory around it. Um, and prior to that, I also was like, oh, well, there's auditory, there's visual, there's technical learning, but it is in truth so much more, so much more. I had a conversation with an accountant this morning, and she says, well, Carrie, don't you like numbers? And I said, no, I can't stand numbers. I know they're necessary, but I don't like them. And in using that as an example, it stems back to being in grade school and not doing well with numbers.
Mm-hmm.
And so ultimately, what people fail to or often overlook doing is understanding who is the audience as a learner. Who are they? What are they bringing to the table? Another example is, if let's take COVID and the shutdowns, for example. Just about everyone was moving to doing everything related to their work online. Well, if you've got people who are not accustomed to working with computers, that's a heavy ask and burden on them to now say, get online quickly, where you have to be able to navigate these different systems. And if they're fearful, or if they of the computer, if they've never had access to computers and technology before, you should change the requests that you're making of them. So that's why I focus on, let's understand who the learner is specifically. And there's more to it that I share with my clients, but that's the focus of adult learning that I take. And every time I speak with someone, they are just like, I had no idea. And why isn't everyone else talking about that? And I don't know why. That's the thing. I don't know why. I can't answer that, but I love the field, and not only a advocate of adult learning theory, but also being an adult learner. So my knowledge has also impacted my personal life, right? Like how I communicate, how I share, or how I explain things to, my family and my spouse, my friends, and my personal life. So it's really an effective tool to have.
I think of your example with the COVID and learning how to embrace more of the computer. And sometimes we bring that bias into it, like, oh, well, I'm not good at technology, so this is just going to be so hard. And I don't know if this fits in, but like, do the feelings that you bring into something, like you said, oh, I'm not good with numbers, I hate numbers. Well, that's a feeling that you've gotten, that you
Correct.
learned when you were
Correct.
younger, and you've brought with you into adult life. So how do those like biases and feelings affect how we try to learn? Usually we say, well, I'm not good with numbers, so I just shouldn't even try to learn. I'm not good
Right.
with computers, I'm not even going to try. Is that part of it, or is that just something else that gets added?
I would say it's something else that gets added, right? And so if you are, if you were my client, let's say, and in that particular situation where we're getting people to use the computer, and I would ask, well, Dana, do you have a number of employees who are comfortable working with the computer? And if you say yes, then I would ask, how do you know that information? Like, give me evidence that that is fact. If you say no, they don't, then my response is, then it is ineffective to make significant demands on them. Like, it's not a good teaching or learning facilitation method, because there's already a barrier there. And then if you say, I don't know, that's where we start. That's where we start is, okay, well, let's get that information so that we can build learning experiences that actually work and that actually engage them and support them in retaining the information. And most importantly, get them to actually apply the skills or apply the knowledge that you're attempting to teach. But emotion is in there. It's in there.
Oh yeah, for sure. It's always a part. Emotions are always there. Unfortunately,
Always.
we are very emotional beings. We bring emotions in any situation, even though we don't need to, but they always creep in.
Me too.
Well, and so another question I had was, I understand like the adult learning, because as a public speaker, I want to meet my audience where they are. I want them to get the best out of the presentation. And when I facilitate applied improv, I certainly want to first off encourage psychological safety so they feel safe to share.
Yes.
But so I recognize how this can apply for facilitators, presenters, people in the learning development field. But who else can benefit from these aspects of adult learning and learning more about adult learning?
Yeah, I would say individuals who are coaching, life coaches, business coaches, anyone in that space. But the key, if people are really trying to identify, is this something that I can benefit from? Here's the measure. If the focus of your work is to educate people about something, whatever it is, how to have a healthy relationship, financial management, whatever it is, if you are in the business of educating people who are over 25 years old, you can benefit from adult learning best practices. Yeah. And let me just say this, I say 25 very specifically because legally in this country, adults are 18. But when we look at brain development, the final aspect of our brain, the executive system that's responsible for critical thinking and judgment and decision making, develops in the mid to late 20s. So that's the measure that I always use.
I was kind of laughing there because I'm like, I don't know if I'd call myself an adult at 25. Because I know technically I was. Certainly
Right.
I had graduated, I was working, I was quote unquote adulting. But I don't know if I felt quite like an adult, but I'm sure my brain was at adult status for sure.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And honestly, Dana, I'm middle-aged and there are oftentimes I don't quite feel like an adult. So, it's we're going to look at the theoretical compared to the practical and such,
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and Carrie, I'm curious too, because I know we've talked about this. You had started in athletic training and then you switched careers to adult learning. You got your PhD. I'm sure just for your example, like that probably took some adult learning just in how you studied and how you learned these in your classes. Did that come into play as you're like learning about adult learning and you're like, oh, like I'm using these skills? Like, did it kind of come full circle for you?
I felt like I was in therapy every time I was in class, in this one particular class. But to start it off, I will say this. So I did, I still hold my retired status of my certification as an athletic trainer. So I worked clinically. I worked in Division I athletics for a number of years. And in that, I was training, I was educating. So I wasn't doing like the physical training, but I was educating patients, athletes, coaches, parents, administrators on best medical practices for the athlete. So there was that level of education. And then I was recruited to another university to be an educator in athletic training education. And that's where the my formal skills developed around instructional design. But I was also maintaining my my healthcare credential at that time. And this is where the switch happened. The more experience I gained as an athletic trainer, I would go to our annual conference and continuing education experiences. And I found that with every year that I had more education, the training and the conferences were not meeting my needs, right? They weren't
Mm,
meeting my
mhm.
learning needs, right? And this went on for a good 10 years, and it just got more and more significant, right? Like I was entering middle age and I had been in this career for so long. And I'm like, I'm spending all this money. I'm away from my family on the few times that I have a vacation, and I'm not getting my learning needs met. And there's some stories on my website that are really alarming, but also help also add context. And so it was at that time, toward the end of my tenure in athletic training, that I realized, like, there's got to be more for me professionally. And so I explored doctoral programs and was stumbled upon adult learning. And that's when it just clicked. It literally clicked. I said, this is where it needs to be, because as a healthcare provider, as a healthcare educator, I knew that there were standards that I needed to meet, but the way the information was framed for my continued education, it was missing the mark for me. And the more I had conversation with others is when I realized, like, I just kept hearing the same thing from other people, and this is typically what I would hear is people would go to any type of training, and I'd say, well, how was it? Carrie, it's an hour of my life that I can't get back.
Oh no.
Yeah.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Whoa.
And so I just thought, if I keep hearing this same messaging from different people, clearly there's something there. And so when I chose to leave higher education permanently and start consulting full time, it, you know, I I continue to see a need for companies and other businesses that are in, like, part of their work includes educating people about something, and the companies that want to get it right and do better for their employees or their patients or their customers. Those are the people that I end up working with, because they're truly committed to engaging, learning, supporting learning from a like an information retention perspective, and then skills application. It's so important.
I can relate to that with the conferences. Well, first of all, conferences online, like virtual conferences, forget
Mm-hmm.
it. I didn't retain a
Yeah.
single thing because, to be honest, I wasn't focused. I was like
Yep.
answering emails and stuff, and I
Yep.
just couldn't ever allow that time. They'd have some virtual conferences that were all day, and I was like, I can't take a whole day. Like, if I'm home, if I'm
Right.
remote, like, I'm going to work. So it was really hard with just during the pandemic when they had remote conferences to even give myself the time to focus to try to retain and hear what was
Yeah.
being said. um, but then I can relate to that on just in-person conferences. I find, at least in last year when I went to a few conferences, I found that to be inspiring in the
Mm-hmm.
sense of, like, it gives me ideas. Like, I kind of learn what others are up to, and then it
Right.
like the ideas start swirling, and I came up with a few good ideas,
Mm-hmm.
but I didn't necessarily, to your point, learn
Mm-hmm.
anything like to keep me going professionally, if that makes
Mm-hmm.
sense. So I can definitely
Yeah.
relate to what you were saying.
Absolutely. And my experience was these were healthcare related conferences. And so and again, let me say, athletic training as a profession has been incredible to me. This is in no way disparaging the profession. It is a profession that I absolutely love. Yet there have been, sessions that I would attend that were support sponsored by, or the speakers were working in the NFL, let's just say, and I think it's great that those individuals are willing to offer insight and their experiences. I never worked in the NFL. And so the
Hmm.
topic may be one that I want to learn more about, but I never worked in a place that had that level of resources. And
Right.
so the message, right? Like the topic fits, but when you're delivering the message and there's no um, adjustment for who the audience is, it falls flat. So, like you, I would sit there and I'm inspired, and in the moment, I'm learning something new. But as soon as I would leave the room, it's lost. It is truly lost because it's not applicable to my life. I have barriers that they don't have, from a financial perspective and such. And
Right.
so yeah, and so that's where I bring in, when I meet with clients, where we talk about why I put such a strong focus on who are the learners. Because if you are missing the engagement piece, if people can't see themselves in what you're saying, like that's it. You just hit stop, because you're not going to get the retention and you're not going to get the skills application. And so you're basically done.
So, from that point, could you provide some examples or something where, like, what happens when adult learning best practices are not used versus when they are used? Meaning, like, I guess, what the audience perceives and also outcomes too.
Yeah. So the first, I always encourage people to focus on engagement, right? And engagement is not entertainment. Let me first
Mm,
say that. They are
that's
not,
such a good point.
yeah, they are not the same. So I advocate for engagement. Well, Carrie, how do you engage, adult learners? You have to understand who adult learners are, and by understanding who they are, you incorporate that in your messaging. If you know that your adults, your audience is made up of mothers between the ages, like mothers who are first time moms, there are elements of that experience that you could incorporate and use as examples as you're helping them. So because they're able to see themselves in what you're saying, they're engaged. They're going to lean in. They're going to stick with you. Their level of motivation stays with you. It stays there because they're like, yep, this is it. This is it. So you've got that. You've got them engaged. The next part of that is, with engagement comes comprehension and retention. So if you can keep someone engaged while you're teaching, you're going to support their learning of the topic, right? So let's just say if these are first time moms who are not healthcare providers, why would you talk to them or present information to them at a highly scientific level, right? They don't understand that, right? There's an assumption that they wouldn't understand that. So
Right,
you've
right.
got them engaged, and now that you're trying to teach them and help them in retention, now you've lost them, because the way you're presenting the information for them to learn and remember, it's beyond their ability. But if you're able to build, right? So that's where the instructional design piece comes in. If you're able to build the learning experience in a way that they can actually understand it and remember it, now you are transitioning them to skills application. And it's not enough to simply say, okay, well, go off. I gave you the information, go off and now do it. And I would argue that that's where a lot of people stop. They stop at the comprehension and retention. But to have meaningful outcomes and to actually achieve your outcomes, you have to support these individuals in skill development, because you can't apply what you haven't developed. And so,
Right.
skill development is a key part. And how do you support adults in skill development? You go back to who they are and you give them examples from their own life, you use their own experiences for them to apply, whatever the information or the skill is. And that's how you achieve the outcome. So it's hard for me to say what the outcomes will be because it depends on the context, but the outcome is that they will develop the skills application.
For the most part, would you say to have some kind of like exercise portion in there where people can practice the skills in some way, shape, or form?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And again, in order to make the activity meaningful, that's the key part. In order to make the activity meaningful, I recommend going back to looking at, well, who are these adults? What's going to be meaningful for them? And it often changes. Like you might be presenting on the same topic, but if your audience changes, those activities should change as well.
Right, right. I can relate from my public health background. I know in my health promotion classes, they always talked about keeping it at a 6th grade reading level. The literacy piece when you're doing promotions, even when speaking too, not to use all this jargon, and certainly if you're in front of a group of like-minded professionals, you can use the acronyms, use the jargon because they're probably familiar with it.
Right.
But most audiences you have to recognize are some of the best practices saying to use simpler terms and more keep it simple for the learners. You don't want to overwhelm them with information.
Yeah. And that's in that centerpiece of learning comprehension and retention. And again, the only way that you will know that is if you have a clear understanding of who the audience is, right? Like so I had someone ask me to explain to them a medical procedure, right? Like I have a sports medicine background. So there are things that I fully understand. But doctor is a PhD, right? It's not an MD. So like there are philosophical but they didn't know that. They just saw a doctor and they knew that I had they knew I had some sports medicine. So they were asking me this question and I was able to explain it to them up to a point because that's as far as my knowledge went. And they were like, well, what happens with this? And then they started reading me like lab results and such. And I said, I don't know what any of that stuff means. Like, that is far beyond. And the look in their face, they were like, but you're a doctor. And I said, two different things. It's two different things. And I say that because, again, you have to know the audience. They were asking me questions with an assumption that I'm a medical doctor, right? They saw the doctor in front of my name and simply made the assumption. And that's, why I say focus on really understanding who your audience is, because on paper, they may look like one thing, but that may not be truly who they are.
I love what you said too. I was taking notes as you were talking, but I love the point that engagement is not entertainment. So you don't have to come out and be this like wacky person just to get attention and to keep their attention focused. What really grabs attention and holds it is your ability to connect with the audience. And you can connect through credibility by being someone of an authority figure or a knowledge figure, or connecting on their level. I understand what you're going through. I've been here too. Whatever way that you can connect, I think is where you find the engagement. And I hadn't heard that engagement is not entertainment, but that makes that hits a lot of buttons there.
Yeah, that that takes away, I think, a lot of
Mm-hmm.
noise in terms for people who are getting started in facilitating learning experiences. It's, there's there's the assumption that you have to have a big voice and you have to,
Mm-hmm.
be flashy or sexy, whatever the case may be. And I am none of those things. And I advocate that you don't need those things to have your interaction and connection with people be meaningful. It's really about your audience. It's not about you. And, when I talk to businesses, and HR departments, they're like, but Carrie, we have to like get the new government standards out and people need to know this. They said that I don't argue that. However, when you make it about either, when you make it solely about the content or solely about our governing body expects you to know this and no credence is given to who these individuals are, you're really doing a disservice to all of it.
I was thinking as you were talking about that and like businesses doing trainings, how sometimes it kind of seems like a check the box kind of thing.
Mhm.
Like, well, we've got to do DEI training now. We got to do sexual harassment training. It's a check the box thing. And here I am like trying to get through it as quick as I can because it's taken out of my day and
Right.
it's because there's no it's because it's a completion thing. Like you must complete
Absolutely.
this. But if it's spun in a different way as to like this will help how we interact with each other and how we treat each other as human beings, that's putting a certain spin on it, I think
Mhm.
can help, just create more meaning to it instead of just making it a check the box.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That idea of checking the box from a departmental perspective, I understand, right? If people have lots of balls in the air and they are held accountable for making sure things get done, I fully understand that. But I also argue that there's an efficient way to get information to people and help them retain it and be in line with new guidelines that are not an added burden for anyone. So that's also part of the work that I do is helping people through that process.
Yeah, that's important work because I think, we can all say that we've sat through a training or a presentation that is an hour plus. Sometimes it's like a full
Yeah.
day of training that we will never get back. And what a shame. What a waste.
Yeah.
You've got the time, you had the stage, and it just wasn't meaningful. And I understand you're not going to reach everyone. It's very
Right.
difficult to reach
Right.
everyone, but reaching the majority of your
Mhm.
learners, what a shame that you missed out.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And there's a lot of parts that go into it. And I would say that that's, sometimes people just don't know where to start. And that's okay. We all have levels of expertise in different areas and interest in different areas. So that's okay. And, I would extend that I'm always here to support people as they need.
Yes. Well, I know you've been really supportive, just as a public speaker, like talking with you. I'm learning a lot from this conversation. And I want to get more into your public speaking background and journey, learning a little bit about that. And also talking about how improv kind of fits in because I see a lot of connections there, but I'm curious how you see it fitting in. So let's take a quick break and
Okay.
we'll jump back in right after this. Welcome back, everyone. We're here talking with Dr. Carrie Graham, all about adult learning, which, at least for me, I see fits in really well with public speaking and engaging your listeners. So, Carrie, I wanted to ask you first, Can you tell us more about your public speaking journey? You've done a lot of public speaking, 25 plus years of experience presenting. You've been a researcher, presenter in an educational sense. How was your public speaking journey? Did you always like it, or did you have to learn to like it?
I hated it. Let me just say, I'll just put it out there, full transparency. I hated it. So I was a shy child, like really a really shy child. And so speaking even in small groups was not common for me. And I didn't grow up in a large family. So it was, not a lot of talking or vying for position to talk. And but I learned early in my career as an athletic trainer that I had to, in order to keep my job, I had to speak to people with confidence that I didn't know. So I have to go introduce myself to another team or get another guest or whatever the case may be. And that's really where it started. Is I consistently gave myself a pep talk before or as I'm walking over to these people. And then when I moved into the classroom, it was really like, that's just jumping off the deep end, I think.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Totally.
it was really challenging. And I'm so appreciative to all of my students, like that first year, those college students, like I just appreciate them so much with their patience. But you know, I did the best that I could. I learned that I got so nervous that I shouldn't eat before I speak. So,
Really?
so I was like 17 years as a professor, and I would rarely eat like within the hour before, because even up until the end, like there were elements of it that I would get queasy on. So there's that. But here's a tip. So if there's anyone in your audience who's listening, and I'm curious if you think this is improv, but I remember very distinctly, I was speaking at my first international conference, and the full sweating. And I was like, Carrie, you can't be up there sweating, like pull it together. And so what I learned was, if I sit in the audience, like close to the stage, easy access to the stage, and I not review my notes, that I literally,
Oh.
yeah. And so what I would do is I would make lists, like I would make a grocery list. I'd make a list of the things I needed to do when I get home. Like I totally detached from being present in that environment. Like I was just in another world until they said, okay, Carrie. And so by that time, like there's no time for me, there was no time to get nervous again. And so I would walk up to the podium, and it was so much easier for me to start presenting and really be focused and just not afraid when I detached from that situation. And even now, I have to say, there are definitely times when I've been asked to speak publicly, as for my business, and I'm like, okay, how can you best handle this? And depending on what the circumstance is, I have to detach. So I'll sit, like if it's on the computer, I'll sit and okay, what are all the things I need to do after this is over until they say go?
I love that. Thanks for sharing that. One,
Mhm.
it's really interesting just that you found what works for you, because
Mhm.
that's the key. When you're public speaking, doing anything outside your comfort zone, you've got to find what works for you. So
Yeah.
something that works for one person doesn't mean it works for you.
Right.
And so kudos to you for finding that works. I think why that works for you, because you've prepared really well. I imagine you've prepped your presentation, you've really practiced it, you've learned it, you know what you're going to say.
Right.
And so just relating it back to my speaking, I don't always feel like I prep well as I could have. and should
Gotcha.
have. So I feel like I'm at the end almost quote unquote cramming and trying to be like, okay, this is what I'm going to say. This is my outline.
Mm,
But that gives me a lot of anxiety and a lot of nerves. So
yeah.
I might try the detachment thing because by the time I get there, I do know what I'm going to say. Like, so what is like reviewing it really quickly going to actually do? One thing that works for me is just at least knowing the first few things that I'm going to say, because
Yeah.
I've definitely gotten up there. Just, I was thinking of my master's presentation. I didn't do a thesis, but I did like a project and we had to
Yeah.
present, do an hour-long presentation. And at the time I was like, oh my God, an hour presentation. Like, how will I ever get through that? And now I do like hour and a half long podcast. It's not an issue now. But
Right.
I remember starting that, and I literally stood up there, and my mind went blank. Like I was like, "Oh God, what
Yeah.
was I going to say?" And it was something like kind of silly, but just like a nice little intro. And I totally blanked, and that was nerves too. I do like the like detachment, like trusting. That is certainly improv, like trusting your skills, that you know what you're going
Mhm.
to say, and also like making sure it's not perfect to a T, like word for word, like just going up there and trusting that
Mhm.
you know your material, you know what needs to be said, you know you're going to get through this. So yeah, like that trust element is certainly improvisational.
Oh, wow. Wow. Well,
Look at you doing improv
look
already.
at me, look at me. But, I will say, Dana, it didn't just happen, right? I didn't just come upon that practice. I was a lot like you, like, oh, I'm looking at my notes right up until they call my name.
Hmm.
And I realized like it was so anxiety provoking for me. And then then it transitioned to, oh, I'll only look at the outline. And then it was, oh, I'll just sit here and hold the papers, right? I'll just sit and hold my notes. And
Yes.
then, I got to the point where I'm like, it's all ridiculous. Like, let me not think about it. Let me try that. Let me just try to not think about what's about to happen. And
Hmm.
it was that time that it worked. And I'm like, oh my goodness, this is so much easier. I can relax before, I can relax during. But your point is so well taken. It really is identifying what is going to work for you.
Oh yeah, and that practice element too. So if you are finding like me that you're quote unquote cramming at the end, like, oh, I gotta say this. Oh, this is what this slide means. It probably means that you could practice a little bit more. And I
Yeah.
recognize that in myself too. And sometimes I like if I have slides, it's like, oh, I know, like the slide generates or jogs my memory. So I feel
Right.
like I don't need to practice, but actually I'm a bit of a talker, as probably most listeners will agree. So I need to actually keep it concise and I need to practice in order to keep it concise and not ramble. So that's where the
Gotcha.
practicing can certainly help.
Yeah, yeah. And it reminded me of something you said is that this was also around the time when I was working on starting to really dig deep into adult learning and switching, doing public speaking often outside of the classroom. It's not about teaching for me because
Hmm.
those aren't places where I'm teaching. It's really about stirring ideas, supporting people and helping them problem solve. And when you shift from teaching, when you use adult learning to shift from teaching to facilitation, it also adds another element of ease. And so that's, I use adult learning in everything that I do because it makes things easier for me. And I'm an advocate.
Well, and that reminds me that you call your meetings calm consultations. And you bring that calmness when it sounds like when you detach from your material, you're detaching from that anxiety, you're bringing a calmness to your speech, your presentation, that the audience can say, okay, I'm not nervous for this speaker. I can
Right.
now relax with them and enjoy the material that they're sharing. Because what you bring up on stage, it really can affect the audience. If you're nervous and you're in your head, the audience is going to be nervous for you also, and in their heads. So I just relate the calmness of like calm meetings, calm consultations go effectively well, just like calm presentations too. So that level of calmness, however you can find it, is what's important.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think I always tell people life is hard enough, right? Like life is
It
hard
sure
enough.
is.
So don't invite in additional stress, anxiety, like always seek peace and joy and anything that you can do in your work that will bring calm and peace and joy to what you're doing. Do those things.
Yeah, and going back to the facilitation piece, what I found too in facilitating is I find it, I don't want to say easier because there's certain levels of it that are harder,
Mhm,
but
mhm.
it is easier, of course, than having to give like a 60-minute keynote. Because when I
Yes.
facilitate, at least in my applied improv presentations and trainings, I'm doing some of the talking in the beginning, setting psychological safety,
Mhm,
making sure everyone feels safe enough to participate and understands what they're getting into. But
right.
then I allow them to participate in exercises and then we debrief, and it's not just me talking. So,
Right.
I allow them the space to share what they've learned. My biggest thing with facilitation has been learning to be quiet, actually,
Mhm,
and
mhm.
giving the participants space to share. So embracing silence. Like
Mhm.
I've heard it can take 7 seconds for people to respond when you throw out a question to the audience. It could take longer than that. Newsflash. It's not just 7 seconds. So being okay with that and not rushing to be like, well, I experienced this. Did anyone, just like,
Mhm, mhm.
what did you all experience? What did you notice with this exercise? And being really direct with the question too. that's that's been a very hard part of facilitation for me.
Yeah, you are spot on. You're spot on as far as what effective facilitation is. And that time gets longer every time you introduce a new or unfamiliar or complex concept. And you really do, like, I've coached people on facilitation, and there is an uncomfortableness with silence. And I tell them, you really, in order for effective facilitation to work, you have to become comfortable with silence. You don't have to like it, but you really have to be okay with its presence because there's a purpose, right? Like it's
Yes.
not it's not that people don't like you and therefore want you to stand there looking silly. It's if they're processing that information, and for some it takes more time than others, but if you're asking a very complex question or a question that's a new concept for them, it's going to take people longer to one, make sense of the question, and then to formulate an answer. I liken it to Jeopardy. So I
Okay.
really started to get involved in Jeopardy the last couple weeks. And it's, my husband and I, we sit and we try to see how smart we are or not.
Nice.
And there will be times when we both know the answer, but the way they're framing it, like it simply takes time to process the question first, and then to gather the answer, and then to give the answer. And think of it as Jeopardy. Just think of it as Jeopardy. Like the silence has to be there.
I love it. I was just writing that down. Think of it as Jeopardy.
Yeah.
And that's something I kind of talk about in some of my like team building presentations, that there's always people who jump right in and respond quickly. And then there are others who sit back and kind of mull it over, and they see the world, they gather perspective, and then formulate a good response for them in order to speak. So we all come at it from different angles. And so that's important to remember too. As you're sitting there and it's silent, you're like, it's okay, because they're thinking. They're not just off in La La Land. They're thinking and formulating a response. Just like in Jeopardy, it takes us a little longer. We're not as sharp or as quick as those contestants, and that is okay too.
That is okay. Even though we know the answer, they may have gone on to like 5 more questions, but we're like, we know the answer. So it just takes some people longer than others, and it just is. It is a skill of facilitation, and you just have to learn it. That's all it is. You just have to learn it.
Well, and I'll relate this to others who may not be quote unquote facilitators, but you facilitate in other ways. If you're any kind of team leader or any kind of meeting leader, I lead meetings all the time, and I'm not an actual supervisor or manager, but I lead meetings all the time. And I can sense when I'm like nervous, and I'll like throw out a question and then no one responds. So I like quickly move on. So like these skills can relate in multiple facets of our life, not just being in front of a group too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's whenever you are communicating, I would offer, no matter who it is. Like I use my husband as an example. Oftentimes when we got married, we have totally different careers and totally different upbringings. And I asked him like there would be times I'd ask him a question and he wouldn't answer me immediately. And I realized like he's just trying, and it would be a very simple question, and it simply, he's trying to understand the question, formulate his answer and understanding, and then identify an appropriate way to communicate that. That is a process, right? Like that is an intellectual process that is not easy for anyone. And so if you're in meetings where there's like some expectation that we resolve this issue in 60 minutes, like there's those added contextual elements to it that, you have to learn how to be okay with the silence.
Also learning, just my husband as an example, learning when to ask the questions, because if he's playing a video game or looking at something, that is not the best time to ask a question because it does not even get heard. So it is learning how to communicate, when to communicate, and how to efficiently communicate. And that happens all the time in our daily lives.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's about context, right? Like that's about context. We as adults recognize that when you have another adult who is holding a crying baby and there are other little ones around them, like we know from experience, whether we have children or not, we've seen it enough. That is not the time to ask a pointed question. Like we know that. And so that's part of the adult learning. Like who are our learners, right? Like I understand that someone who is attempting to care for 3 young children, their attention is not on me. Right. And so like we as adults, people over 25, we know that just from years of being on this earth and witnessing people caring for children. And so I say all things go back to adult learning. I would imagine you say all things go back to improv.
Which at the center of it, I think maybe in the Venn diagram of it, it's connection and communication is kind of at the center there. And I do want to ask you too, something I've gotten in my head about with my presentations of the applied improv trainings is, listen, they're very simple. Like the exercises we're doing, they are not rocket science. Not that they have to be, but like one of the exercises, for example, is the time traveler exercise. So you pretend like someone is from the 1600s. They have traveled into the future, into present day, and you have to explain to them what a cell phone is. How are you going to do it? Do you start talking about buttons and well, what's a button? Like a button on my shirt? Or, oh, well, I can take pictures. What's a picture? Is it going to steal my soul? Like,
Right.
You can go down the rabbit hole of explaining, and then do you get frustrated? Do you get exasperated? Or do you give up? Like, how do you handle this difficult task? But I'll say it's very simple. It's all these exercises are very simple. You know, yes, and you might say yes, and to planning a party. So what I've struggled with is like, well, these aren't super hard exercises conceptually, but my takeaway is, and this is how I have to explain it and rationalize this to businesses, is the takeaways are very profound. You know, what you learn out of that time traveler exercise is, how do I handle conversations with people who are not on the same wavelength as me, which is often the case. Like, how do I handle those conversations? And so I think the takeaways you can get are very profound, but I think, and I recognize I could probably do a better job explaining it and highlighting it too.
Well, I hear what you're saying. And I think the thing, you would have to identify what is it that you highlight, right? Because as you were explaining that as a takeaway, I heard emotional intelligence there. Because as someone who, like, if I were trying to explain to a time traveler what a cell phone was, I know that I would become incredibly frustrated. Okay, but that's about me. It has nothing about them. And so, how am I able to manage my own emotions? How am I regulating stress? How am I engaging in conversation in the midst of my own emotional turmoil? And so, I think it's focusing on what is the anticipated outcome. And if it's the anticipated outcome is emotional intelligence or effective communication, then that's what you focus on. Like, that's how you present it and position it. If it's, you know what, we're just going to have a little bit of silliness and some fun, right? Like, so then in that regard, you're focusing on whatever the anticipated outcome is, right? And so I would say the same thing with people who are educating individuals. Like, I had a client once who was a financial advisor, and he, he started talking about the numbers, Dana, and I had to stop my own. I was sad. I had to stop my own client, and I'm like, wait a minute, wait. And I asked him, I said, what is your main objective here? What is it that you want people to walk away with? Do you want them to understand the numbers or something else? And he goes, no, the numbers really don't matter. What I want people to understand is that the numbers allow you to make better decisions around retirement. And I said, then that's where your focus needs to be on, and not like having a lot of conversation around these numbers. And so it's, again, understanding what is the anticipated outcome, and then who are you talking to?
Thank you for that. Yeah, it's funny the pressure we put on ourselves. I think just to be this like super complex concept, this new concept. And really what I've found is just these simple games and exercises. And I'll tell you, I've been in many corporate trainings where it's like, okay, we're going to get into pairs and role play, and I'll roll my eyes at role play exercises. But something, and probably that's the facilitator, it's something with like the different exercises, and maybe making them so simple too, actually helps. Like, these are simple exercises. So it's easy to be successful, and then it's easy to experience what the takeaways are because they're easy. And then you can apply that to harder situations. See, I'm learning. See, I'm putting it all together as we're talking here. I'm like
And
connecting the dots finally.
and that's the thing, Dana, right? Is we're talking about this subject from your perspective. We're not talking about it from my perspective. So you're engaged in this conversation because you're like, oh, we're talking about, facilitating trainings. That's what you do. And that's why it's making sense right now. And that's why you're like intellectually, your brain is actually building on the concept. So your audience is getting to hear it and see it live. Like they're hearing it in action.
Yeah, look at that. Well, and Carrie, I'm curious from your perspective. I know you don't know a lot about applied improvisation, but from how we've talked and kind of I've explained to you like the focus of the training, and then it is a lot of more experiential exercises. Yes, they're simple exercises, but they're experiential exercises. So that way you can, I want to use your terms, apply the skills and develop the skills, and then see how they can apply to larger situations in life. So how do you see adult improvisation, applied improvisation for adults relating to adult learning?
Yeah, well, I'll use the example because I think it is appropriate for the work that you and I do, that both of us do. So if we take workplace learning and the work trainings in the workplace, using the improv activities are great. I would say that to make it meaningful for workplace learning, it should have a couple elements. The first is what activity can help develop the skills that we actually need, right? So I've actually played yes and in a thing. And how I would use that one is if we are trying to work on collaboration, right? We have a team that really struggles with collaboration and, doing it seamlessly. Using yes and is a great activity, a great improv activity where the skill engaged in it is around collaboration, right? If we're struggling with trust, yes and, right? Like we're going to use this activity to help us build some trust that we can do whatever. So I would say that it's really important that people are selecting an improv activity, no matter how small, like how easy, but select one where you can directly match the skills used in the activity to the outcomes in the training that you want. And that's not always an easy task, but it's worth giving attention to because it provides people with a low stakes opportunity to learn and practice playing the game. And then when you debrief and talk about it, there's an easier link to application. And ultimately that's what you want, is you want to support people in applying whatever the skill is. So yes, we are all adults and we are complex human beings. However, when it comes to learning, like we got a million things going on in our heads and on our schedules that we're really thinking about. So in this one moment in time, let's make it as easy as possible. So it's selecting the most appropriate activities to engage and retain, like providing instructions that help them retain the skills and information. And then we're giving them opportunity to practice. And then when we debrief, we're doing it again, debriefing What did you like? What was challenging? That's the engagement piece. Well, why? Right? Like, don't just say what was, like, was it this or that, but ask them why. That's the comprehension and the retention. And then when you say, oh, okay, well, what can you do to change that? Or what can you do to improve that? That's another element of skills application.
Fantastic. That's,
Mhm.
yeah, that's super helpful. That why question, I was like, oh,
Yeah.
write that down, because a lot of times I'll ask, like, well, what did you get out of
Mhm.
it? What was your takeaway? And then the next question can be, why? Like, how did
Mhm.
you come up with that? And
Yeah. And so when we think about, when we go back to people's level of comfort with facilitation and public speaking, when you ask the question why, it is a one word question, 3 letters, and then you sit back and you wait. That will give them more meaning because they now have to, well, why do I think that? Why did I feel that way? And then they'll start to ask themselves why, like as they're making sense of it. And then they have to figure out a way to answer you that makes sense. So all you've said is, well, why is that? Like just very lovingly and kind, like, well, why is that? Why do you, like, we're all can have different opinions, but why is that your opinion? And give them time and space to process. And you would be amazed at the level of appreciation that people will have. That, like, it's by asking the why, they walk away with, oh my goodness, that,
Mhm.
they you will see that people will respond differently than when you just stop at the what.
I'm thinking of presentations too that are more educational, informative, maybe more of like a webinar type of thing where you're showing slides. You don't really have access to put people into groups and do exercises. It isn't a webinar format. So how can you still get that like skills development without maybe having them practice the exercises? Would you tell them like what an exercise is? Like, I'm just because I have to do some of these too, and I'm like, how can I build that into even like a webinar type of format? That why question.
Yeah, I would say both, right? So there's what you were saying is give them the example and fully explain the example. That's one option.
Mm-hmm.
I say even if it isn't a webinar, I'm going to encourage you, I'm going to invite you all attending this webinar to jot down your answers to this one question. I'm going to give you 1 minute.
Mm.
Why? Right? Like, who's to say the webinar has to be you consistently talking, right? Like, just because we've experienced that, it doesn't mean that that's the best practice. And so,
Right.
if you identify that you want to ask the question why, and like provide them time and space, it may not be 5 minutes of time and space, but to at least give people 1 minute to sort of like toy with their response to the question of why, like that's meaningful to people because as adult learners we want to know and we want to understand why. So it's giving, like, again, it all goes back to understanding who adult learners are, and that's one of our characteristics. We do want to know, well, why do I need to know this, or why does that matter? And so you give it, just give it freely.
Mm-hmm. I love that. Yeah, and just sometimes that break in you talking is what they need to like
Hmm.
refocus and also to like have some introspection and reflect on what this means to them. And I think I'm so guilty of this. We get caught up in sharing all the knowledge and all the
Right.
information, and And then it is no longer simple and easy to understand because we've thrown so many concepts at them in this 30 minutes or an hour webinar presentation, and we've given them no time to reflect. So I'm getting a lot of light bulbs going off here in this conversation, just how to improve. And I always hear like keep it simple, but that is easier to say than to do.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And in that regard, you really have to be what I've found over the years of my career is you have to not only fully understand the content, but you also need to understand the context.
Mm-hmm.
Like it doesn't make a lot of sense to talk about macronutrients to a group of dietitians, dietetics, and nutritionists.
Mm-hmm.
So why would you spend time, like, why would you embed that in your presentation and spend time on that when they know, like, there is no argument that they know that information. Like, in order to be certified and registered, they have to know that basic level information. And so I would say, again, understanding who your audience is, one, two, what is the content that you want to share? And then what is the context that you're presenting it? If it's a mixed group of, let's just say, healthcare professionals in general, then yeah, a quick review of that information might be great and then move on. If it's
Mm-hmm.
community members who may not understand what the word macronutrient is, well, that's where you stop. You like we don't need
Right.
to go into micronutrients. We need to just focus on the macronutrients. And so, again, what's the context? And here's another idea for context. We're talking to a group of nutrition students, undergraduate
Mm-hmm.
nutrition students, right? Like some may have taken chemistry, some may not. Okay, we can talk about both macronutrients and a little bit about micronutrients. Do they need to know that information? Absolutely, they do. So, I mean, it's so often we focus only on the content.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the same holds true with improv. And please correct me, it's not about the content always. It's simply the context and who's the receiver of the information or who's the giver of the information.
Yep. Spot on. Just in comedic improv in general, there's so many notes that I've received. It's like, it's not, there is narrative improv too, where you
Mhm.
like tell a story and you do an improvised play. Most comedic improv is not narrative improv. So I always get caught up in the narrative and what needs to be said. It's like, you're forgetting the relationships. Like that is what people care about on stage. And as audience members, they care about the relationships between the two people.
Yeah.
So I've gotten many a notes on that. But it's so true. So you're right. It holds true in a lot of aspects of our
Yeah.
lives.
Absolutely.
Well, and Carrie, I wanted to ask you too, and I don't know if this is a little different from adult learning in terms of teaching adults information. We talked about in the beginning how we were in a risk takers group, and I'm
Yeah.
curious how you handle new creative endeavors. Part of it, at least what I've learned as an adult, is that I don't handle new creative endeavors or new things very well. Like I expect to be good at everything right off the bat. Maybe I had that as a kid. I don't know. I don't know where I've gotten this expectation from. But how do you handle new endeavors in any sense? Like, do you embrace it as a beginner, or do you expect to be good at it?
That is an unexpected question, and it is a great question to ask. It really is. You know, I admittedly, and I have to be honest here, I for me, in reflecting on that, it depends on what it is. So I always try to take life as an adventure. Every day of life is an adventure. I have no idea where, if I'm having a conversation with someone, I have no idea where it's going to go. And that's okay. And relinquishing control in that regard of viewing life as an adventure and freely walking through that. But there are times where something will come up. Well, let me say this. Creative work, I'm all in. I'm like, I don't know what's going to happen here, but this is creative. But when it comes to things that are definitely tangible, related to my business, quite honestly, it's more difficult for me. It is more difficult for me. And the reason being, and it is around technical things. The reason being is part of it is my ego, honestly, because I say, I attempt it and it doesn't work. And the next narrative is, well, I'm a smart enough person. I can figure this out. And then I try and I've become increasingly frustrated. And then my response is, it's totally ego driven. Well, I have a PhD. Why can't I figure this out? And so it's very egocentric now that I'm saying this out loud.
You're not alone. You're not alone. So I relate fully to that.
Okay. But yeah, I think that's really what it comes down to. And so like I travel down this narrative, and sometimes it takes me longer than other times. And I have to remind myself, like, this isn't your skill set. Like, it just isn't. You weren't trained in this. You don't have this level, like this depth of experience on this particular topic. And what I'm finding most recently, you don't like this. You don't like it, period. Like, for whatever the reason, and the reason doesn't matter, you don't like it. So, and often those things that I don't like, it is within my control to have someone else do. And so it's, it depends. It depends. It really depends. But like everyday life, when people invite me to go do something that I've never done before, I'm like, sure, I'll try. Like, I don't know what's going to happen, but like, I'll try it. It makes for good storytelling. Let me say that. Like, I have such good stories about things I've tried and will either never do again, or I'll try it again. Yeah.
I love that view life as an adventure piece, because that really is improv too at its fullest. Is, we don't know how this conversation's going to go. We don't know how this experience is going to go. You go out with friends to try something new. You don't know how it's going to go, but hey, life's an adventure, and why not try something new? But it's that ego that gets in the way of going, well, I should be good at this. And I have a PhD. I have my master's. I was an athlete growing up. Like, I should be able to pick this up. And it's these weird expectations, egocentric expectations that we have, that we don't allow ourselves to just be beginners and learn. So, thank you for sharing that. It's hard.
It is. And I truly appreciate you asking the question. And, that's oftentimes when people invite me to have conversation, they say, okay, well, what is off the table, or what do you want to talk about? I often say, like, it doesn't matter to me, right? Like, as long as we're having a respectful conversation, I'm going to learn something. And I always learn something, whether it's about the other person, the topic, or myself. Or the other thing that happens is I develop a stronger foundation in the things that I believe, or in the things that I'm doing, because I'm it's another opportunity to share it with others, whether they agree or disagree. So yeah, viewing life as an adventure is, it really is a way that I live my life and have for most of my adult life. And I will just share this. I was had a recent surprise birthday party, and my mother shared that my mother shared.
Yay.
Yeah, thank you. My mother shared with everyone how she really wanted me to be a New Year's Day baby, like the first baby in the state.
Oh,
And so she was trying all these things to get me to be born, right? Like jumping up and down on one foot and, all the
that's funny.
nonsense. Yeah. And she said, and I refused. I just refused to come. And so, a week or so later, here I come. And she said, what she recognized is that from day one, I just would do things on my own terms. And there was, in all honesty, there was quite a bit of my career where I lost sight of that. And
Mm.
and now I have reclaimed it, and again am really embracing that element of who I am, which is truly just view life as an adventure and just go with whatever comes my way. And so I really, hope that I want to invite your listeners to, be reflective of who they are and how they view life and the world, and what it is that they want out of the one life that we all get, and step into it. And, it can be whatever it is that you want it to be for yourself, because it's yours, right? I'm not living Dana's life, and Dana isn't living my life. And so it's how we choose to live it is, like, we have to live with those decisions. And so just, do what makes you happy. Just be nice. Let me say this. Be nice and kind to other people, but do what makes you happy.
That's such a good asterisk. Like, do what makes you happy, but also be nice, be a
Yes.
respectful
Yes.
human too. Uh, well, and Carrie, so this kind of leads to my last question that I ask a lot of our guests, and you've kind of answered it already, although I'm sure you've got another example here. But, live life as an adventure. That's similar to a yes and mindset. And I know you've said you've played the yes and exercise, you're familiar with yes and, but essentially yes and is like a growth mindset as well. And viewing life as an adventure, I'll add. I love that term and phrase. So how do you embody a yes and or growth mindset in your life?
Yeah, I would say, you know, just basic everyday practical things like, yes, and Carrie, do you want to try this guinea pig as an entree? Yes, and I'm either going to love it or I'm not, right? So I have done that, right? Like
Wow,
I was in another
nice.
country, and like that was like sort of like that's the thing. And I just said, when am I going to be in this country again? Yes, and well, what comes after the and for me it was, I'm either going to really like it and want more, or I'm not. So I'll say yes and more, or yes and no thank you to any more, right? So
Right.
it really, like, in the past, it has served me well. And moving forward, thank you for the reminder of viewing life as a yes and it really opens possibilities. I think it really opens possibilities of when you say yes, you are agreeing to go in a direction, but when, like, just to turn in a direction. But when you say and, you're committing to moving forward in that direction specifically. And we just don't know what's at every single direction. And so why not? I used to, I'll end with this. I used to tell my undergraduate students, they would always come to me and they'd say, Dr. Graham, I don't want to move away to grad school, or what should I do? Or there's this perfect job for me, but it's on the other coast. And I would always tell students, going to grad school is at most 2 years of your life. At most. It is only 2 years of your life. So go, use that as an opportunity to go wherever. Say yes and just go. Because three things will happen. One, you will hate it. And
So
really,
true.
right?
Yes.
Like, you'll hate it. And if that's the case, it's okay because you tried. And so I'm okay with quitting, right? Like, people frown down on quitting, but
Oh yeah.
quit, right?
You
Like,
don't need
finish,
all those loans if you don't.
right,
Yeah.
right. Like, so finish the semester and then go home, but you have an experience. The second thing is, you are there for the 2 years and you realize, like, which is a growing experience, but then you realize, I don't want to stay here.
Mm-hmm.
You go back. And then the last thing is, you say, this was a great experience. Yes, I did it, and I want to do it again. And so you move on to another location. So no matter what the experience is at the end, it's growth.
Mm-hmm.
So when you say yes, I firmly believe you will only grow no matter what the outcome is. There will definitely be growth. And that's part of being an adult. When adults are who they are, because we have so much life experience. Like, that defines us. Like, we have a wealth of life experience that we draw from in order to learn in the present time. So using the improv activity of yes and is a yes and mindset is the perfect way to be an adult learner.
Bravo. Bravo. Beautiful answer there. And I just think of all the pressures I've put on myself when deciding on schools and then grad schools. And it's like the outcome here is growth. Whatever
Right.
you decide, the outcome is growth. And that's a huge thing to remember too.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
that's such great advice and very applicable to any decision we have to make.
Mhm.
And I was just,
Whether it's eating a guinea pig, going to grad school, starting a business, right? Like, just say yes.
I was just thinking, somebody was telling me, like, you need to think about starting a newsletter for the business. No, I don't want to. Like, I've written so many wellness newsletters and stuff. Like, I am nervous I won't keep it up, whatever, blah, blah, blah. And just hearing you, I'm like, I'm really closing off that channel of growth there. I'm I can say yes in some capacity and I don't have to do a weekly
Right.
newsletter. And
Right.
by saying no, I'm really closing off that path. If I say
Yeah.
yes, I can still explore the path and it still might lead to no eventually, but
Mhm.
I need to say yes to explore it more instead of just cutting it off and be like, no, I don't wanna.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And also changing the narrative to, like, this as an example. Yes, and it's not going to be, right? But you could say yes, and it will be bi-monthly, or yes,
Mhm.
and it will be quarterly, so that the full statement that you're giving it is in the affirmative, as opposed to being able to pat yourself on the back for saying yes, and then there's a but in there, like, but I'm
Yep.
not doing this, right? Like, give it the full affirmative, because when you do that, it's, like, you're really committing. And I'll go back to the guinea pig as an example. They were like, okay, Carrie, so you've said yes to tasting it. What part do you want? And so that's where I was like, what does my life experience tell me? My life experience is that I like breast meat, right? Like it's, I can just handle breast meat like on a bird or
Right.
something. And so I'm
Right.
like, I don't know if it has a breast or not, but whatever is closest to that kind of meat, like I'll try that part. And so it's yes and a breast, right? Like I don't know what it has, and I still don't know what it has, but that's how I responded. So I think there's like say yes, but then we as adults draw from our past experience to say what is the thing after the and.
Hmm.
Like we get to decide that.
What was the outcome of your guinea pig experience? Would you eat it again?
I sure would. I
Really?
sure would.
Okay.
I really so like it's just whole. Like it's just whole. So the face is looking at you with the teeth and the neck. Like
Oh, wow.
it is
Okay.
it's hideous to look at. So I just turned the head away from me and covered up the feet. But the way it was seasoned, like seasoning in my mind is next to God, right? So like the seasoning was it was impeccable. So I'd eat it again. I
Okay.
wouldn't make it a weekly staple and I surely wouldn't buy it or, to make in the house. But if I were in Peru again and someone makes an offer, absolutely, I'll try. I'll try.
And you never would have known that if you said, "Oh, no. Ugh,
Right.
gross." Like, so now you
Absolutely.
know.
Now I know and it's a story to tell.
It's a good story and an applicable story too. Very relatable to many things.
So many things.
Well, Carrie, this has been so much fun, and I love talking with you and learning more about adult learning, and just it really does make you think how we have conversations with people and how we're treating our listeners, our audience members, our communication partners. It's so relatable in so many ways. So I just appreciate you starting the conversation about adult learning today. Where and how, if our listeners are like, I need to know more, where and how can they find out more about you?
Yes, I thank you for the invitation and thank you for having me, Dana. Again, saying yes to you was easy and I had such an amazing time, right? And so there's my yes. And so thank you for the opportunity to share time with you and your audience. And if your audience members are interested in learning more about me, I invite them to visit my website at drcarriegraham.com and look around. There's some personal things about me, about my story and the work that I presently do. And if people are interested in learning more, they're always welcome to contact me. But visiting my website at Dr. Carrie Graham is always the best place to find me.
Yeah, and we're connected on LinkedIn. You post some amazing information and resources about adult learning too. So I would highly recommend following or connecting with you on LinkedIn too.
Thank you. Thank you. This was great.
Yeah. I think you're a great first step in learning more about adult learning. Are there any resources too, if someone's like, okay, I need to learn more about adult learning? Check in with you first, but like, are there any like general resources? And this might be on your website too.
Um, I'm gonna say no, only because in the years that I've been consulting, I haven't really, and I have looked, there isn't
Yeah.
really things that are out there for, that's like easy to read, but is comprehensive. So
Right. Right.
if people have a very specific question, they're always welcome to ask me, and I can find an article that I think will best fit their needs. But, I'd hate to say, oh, go read a couple research articles, because again, remembering who the audience is, like that's not always the
Totally.
best fit. Yeah.
I mean, I went to grad school. I can't even read research papers now. I'm like, oh no, I can't. The trauma, the memories, like, and also they're long. So my attention span
Yes.
just isn't there anymore.
Yes, absolutely. So again, if whatever in any way that I can support your audience, they just need to reach out to me at my on my website, drcarriegraham.com, and I will get them what they need.
Fantastic. You are a fantastic resource for adult learning. So, highly recommend if you are in any form of facilitation, presentations, public speaking, communication, in any form you want to learn more about adult learning, please check out Carrie. It's really been eye-opening to chat and learn more about this. And you heard today, I connected some dots too and reaffirmed some things for myself. So it can happen for you too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Dana, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carrie. Really appreciate it. And for our listeners, thank you so much for joining and listening in. I hope this episode was helpful for you in some way, shape, or form. I know I learned a lot in talking with Carrie just from a public speaking perspective. I love her phrase of engagement is not entertainment. So, from a public speaking perspective, we always think, I won't assume you do. I always think that I have to come on and be super bubbly and exciting, and that's going to engage the audience because I'm excited. That'll make them excited. And sometimes it can come off a little off putting too, if you're like too much of I call it like a crazy wannabe cheerleader esque. And sometimes I have felt that way because I've been too excited. And that's also my anxiety making me feel excited and making me feel like I need to be more excited when I speak. And really, sometimes coming in on a calm fashion and letting listeners know this is what you're going to get, that can actually make them feel safer and lets them know what to expect and also what they will get out of the presentation. So, good lessons learned there. But I also think from a improv point of view, however you're listening, whether you're a public speaker or you speak a lot in your professional life, or if you're an improviser for fun or for your professional life, all these things can certainly apply. Like, for example, for an improviser, keeping it simple. I always struggle with wanting to be quote unquote coy and kind of very smart. I don't know how to be smart on stage, but just like, what's the smart thing here? And Carrie brought it up. It's the context, it's the relationship of the individuals, of the scene partners on stage. It's the meaning to the audience. It's not just what needs to follow next in a narrative, what needs to happen. So that was a really good reminder. And then from a public speaking perspective of keeping it simple. And, again, I won't assume I put so much pressure on myself sometimes. Like, oh, I certainly had this last October. I did a 25-minute presentation on creating your 2023 wellness program strategy. And that is a lofty topic that certainly requires more than 25 minutes. But that's all I was given. That's all I had. And I tried to squeeze all of it in 25 minutes. And spoiler alert, the outcome alert, I didn't get to all of my slides in 25 minutes. And I didn't get to the engagement pieces of my presentation. And that was a really big lesson for me is I tried to cram in too much. So I probably lost some of the audience because it was just too overwhelming and too fast. If I had just taken it slower, picked 2 or 3 things to focus on, I probably could have engaged them better and been more inspiring to them in how to start or continue their wellness program strategy. But you learn this as you go, and it's never going to be perfect when you're first starting out. These are always good lessons learned. I'm not beating myself up. I'm just using it as a lesson learned here. And certainly talking to experts like Carrie, who focus on instructional design and adult learning strategies, it's really helpful to see what works and what doesn't. And the stages that she mentioned with the engagement and then the comprehension and retention and then the skills application and development, these are sometimes things that we forget to include. Or, we focus on one aspect more than the other. So, a very interesting topic today. I didn't know much about adult learning, and, there's still more to learn, but it certainly can apply to what I'm doing. And I hope you found it applicable to your life as well and whatever you're trying to do as well. I also loved Carrie's phrase, view life as an adventure. I sometimes think about, just really the past like pandemic years have been very anxious for me. I've had more anxiety than usual, and maybe it's all coming to the surface. Maybe I always had anxiety, but I will admit that I don't sometimes view life as an adventure. I'm trying to more. But when someone asks me if I want to do something, usually I will say yes, if it fits within my schedule and my boundaries. Yes. But then, if it's something new, I'll think of like all the things that can go wrong. Like, oh, what if I don't find parking? It's certainly an LA question. What if I don't find parking? Or if it's kind of like an active thing, like, oh, what if I get hurt? Too, that's always in the background of my mind. Like, oh, what if I get hurt my knee again? There's a lot of anxiety around that. And certainly those are some things I need to deal with too. But I just loved that phrase, view life as an adventure. That inspires me to be more adventurous and in viewing life more as an adventure. And also maybe viewing my business and this podcast as part of the business, viewing my business as an adventure. Sometimes I get caught up in the to-do list and the tasks and, oh, I'm not doing this enough or at all. And got to check the boxes and blah, blah, blah. And it all becomes really overwhelming, but adventures are fun. So if I can view it as an adventure, and yes, it is a serious thing, but it's a fun adventure for me, I might actually have more fun with it than being so overwhelmed all the time. Just a thought there, some inspiration that came up as we were talking. I thought this episode had some really good tips for presenters and facilitators, instructional design facilitators. But let me know if you fit into any of those areas or if you do any kind of communication outside of those arenas. What came up for you in this episode? And I'll use Carrie's question. Why do you think it came up? Why do you think this resonated so much with you? I always ask the question what and how, but why did you feel like this was so important? So feel free to reflect on that. And you're always welcome to reach out to me at Dana, Dayna, at improvlyspeaking.com. Or you can reach out to me on Instagram at improvlyspeaking. I'm on LinkedIn as well. And you can find this podcast episode and other improv resources at improvlyspeaking.com. That's my website. Let me know what came up and why it came up. I need to get used to asking that question, but it is a really important question. Why did this come up for you? And if you don't feel like sharing, I totally understand, but please reflect on that and why you felt it was important. Also, if I can ask a favor, I'll switch gears a bit, but if I can ask a favor, this is a newer podcast. I've started in November. This is a newer podcast. If you find this podcast helpful and relatable, applicable in whatever you're trying to do, and I want to ask you if you can please like and rate and review this podcast. That will help me get it out there more, and it will just help me to know what people find relatable too. And if you want to share your feedback privately, you also are always welcome to do that. If there's anything you'd like to see or hear on the podcast, please pass that along too. I will always take your feedback. All right. Thanks again for listening in and supporting Improvly Speaking. I truly, truly appreciate you. And I look forward to talking to you next time. Take care, everyone.